Welcome back. Now, as stated earlier, in this second section, what we're going to be doing is focusing on nervous system developments. In particular, we're going to look at the brain, the hemispheres, and the connecting nervous system that all changes and develops with age as our bodies develop. Now, when we covered physical development, we recognize that when we look at newborns, there's a lot of things that newborns just aren't capable of doing because their system isn't quite there yet. There's a lot of things that still need to form and a lot of growth that needs to happen. Well, with our brain in particular and part of our nervous system, one of the things that we see which is really interesting is the fact that our brain structure and our systems, even though they're not functioning at a normal level at birth, are actually there at the moment of birth. The things that are there, the things that are really important for us throughout our lives in particular, is the structure of the brain, so the specific lobes that are very important in the area on the top of our brain called the cerebral cortex, and in particular the structural areas of the frontal lobe. If you look to the right, you can see these. The frontal lobe, the temporal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the parietal lobe. Each of those areas, which are eventually used specifically for very basic types of functioning, vision, thoughts, hearing, speech, coordination of movement, all of those areas, those lobes, are actually there at birth. Now, there's much, much more development that has to take place before those things actually work at their maximum capacity. But at birth, we do at least have those particular systems there. Another thing that we have at birth, which is very surprising to a lot of psychologists, is the ability to lateralize with our brains. What this means is that each half of our brain, if you split our brain down the middle, and you can actually see this in the lower right-hand picture, each half of our brain actually controls specific types of functioning. Now, that specific type of functioning is not quite set at birth, but it's already there. The structure is already there, and for the most part, children start to display lateralization in their actions and their brain activity at the moment of birth. The other thing that we have at birth, which is really nice for us, and it allows us to become very, very intricate, very complex individuals, is this concept of something called neuroplasticity. And that's the fact that even though our brain structure is relatively set at birth, the ability for the cells within that brain structure to move, the fact that they have this coordinated capacity, allows for us to adjust to our environment and grow as we age throughout our life. When we look at this concept of neuroplasticity a little bit closer, what we can see is that at birth, when you look at a child's brain, even though that child, as we stated earlier in class, has almost as many neurons, if not as many neurons, as an adult, these neurons aren't very connected. So even though a child is born with 60 to 100 billion neurons at birth, those neurons really are just kind of sitting there. They're connectors, they're tools that we call dendrites that connect them to other cells, along with axons that connect them to other cells, aren't really formed. That means that even though the cells are ready to communicate, a lot of them aren't capable of communicating. But with neuroplasticity, what we have is the ability to have these neurons travel in different directions and extend themselves to other neurons so these cells can actually communicate with each other. And in each individual, the experiences that we have, the stresses that we encounter, cause the neurons within our body to actually move to other neurons, to connect to other neurons, and eventually form what we call synapses, or connections between the neurons, in order for them to communicate effectively and in order to allow us to do all of the complex behaviors that we're actually capable of doing. So even though at birth we don't have those connections formed due to neuroplasticity, as we age and progress throughout our lives, those connections are created and allows us to become much, much more complex than we originally were. Now, this neuronal growth is important for a couple reasons. One of the big reasons why it's exceptionally important is because as we age, as our brain starts to create new connections,
Specifically, the regions of the brain start to become dedicated to very specific tasks. In fact, a classic example of this is a study that was done a while back, actually, and a number of studies have been replicated in this, where we can actually take images of people's brain and look how the brain has been dedicated not only to pick up on language, but the specific language that you're actually speaking. So in one study, what they would do with individuals is have them listen to two different sentences, one in their own language and another in a foreign language that they've never heard. So if you were to participate in this study, you'd probably listen to a sentence first in English and then a sentence in a language from some dialect that you've never heard before. And what we see in these studies is really interesting. Essentially, the region of your brain dedicated to processing language through your past experiences when you were growing up allows for a very specialized part of your brain to be activated when you're listening to the sentence from your own language. But when you listen to a sentence from another language, especially one that doesn't have a lot of overlapping sounds with the language that you're more familiar with, that same area of the brain is not activated. In fact, that area of the brain is fairly dormant while you're listening to this, and other auditory systems are actually activated. And that's really interesting to a lot of psychologists because it tells us that this neuronal migration is not just random. It's allowing cells to connect in order to allow us to process that stuff that we're exposed to very often and that we need to be able to process on a fairly regular basis. Another thing that's really supported this idea was a couple of studies that have been done that looked at kids who were in very impoverished areas. In particular, there was a study done around 30 years ago. It looked at kids who had actually been institutionalized their entire life in Romania. And this was in a very poor neighborhood. And these kids had essentially been sent away and locked away in very tiny rooms, not allowed to really interact with anybody, in order to just kind of keep them away from the population. There were other big reasons for this. It definitely was not an ethical thing by any means, but as researchers, we took advantage of this impoverished environment because we could look at how these children functioned once released from these environments versus a normal child. And you actually can see a picture in the upper right-hand corner of one of those children compared to a normal control person, which is on the left. So in the upper right-hand corner, you see the kid from Romania, the institutionalized child from Romania, doing a number of different tasks. He actually performed a number of different language things, visual things, had to process stuff, and you're looking at the overall amount of activity that his brain exhibited during a very long period of time. That, in comparison to this child on the left, a normal child, we can see shows a very marked decrease in functioning. So the child on the left, you see the reds and the yellows throughout the entire brain, where the child on the right had very little activity throughout this entire process. That deprivation, those events and those experiences, I guess our findings of the lack of activation during those experiences, tells us again that this neuronal migration is not a random thing, but instead a product of experience, a product of kind of the need for our brain to make connections to the important things that we need to do in our environments. Another thing that's interesting when we look at the brain and how it's functioning is that this neuronal migration allows us to overcome specific deficits that we might have encountered along the way. In particular, if we've had an abnormal growth or some type of damage to our brain when we're growing up, because our neurons move, because they collect in different areas, we can actually overcome those deficiencies at a very young age. So if you look in the lower right-hand corner, you'll see two pictures. The picture on the left is a picture of a normal individual, and the picture on the right is actually a picture of a girl who suffered from damage to the left side of her brain. In fact, it was an abnormal growth that required them to remove that entire portion of her brain. Now, what's interesting with this picture is that what they're doing here is having both the control child and the girl on the right do the exact same thing. They're asked to speak a language or speak a sentence. And in that sentence, we see two very different types of activation in the two individuals. For the person on the left, the control individual, we see normal activation, the left hemisphere lighting up, which indicates that they're using a specific region of their brain that's dedicated to the processing of language. But for that girl on the right, even though she was missing an entire half of her brain, or almost an entire half of her brain, She's still fully capable of doing this particular task. It's just that the right side of her brain has now been allocated to this particular task. And this happens a lot when we look at the growth process. Namely, we call this idea neuroplasticity, and the brain's ability to actually go around any problems or any issues that might have occurred in the developmental process. And it's another big benefit we have from this neuronal migration process.
This idea of neuroplasticity, when combined with another thing that happens with growth, allows us to become very complex in a very short period of time. The other idea that allows for rapid growth and rapid association of ideas and physical coordination is a process called myelination. Now, myelination is a very biology-heavy concept. Essentially what it is a number of cells wrapping around these cells that we've talked about earlier called neurons in order to help for these neurons to communicate more effectively. In this class, since we're not a bio class, the only thing I need you to understand with this concept of myelination is that as our neurons become more myelinated, as more cells wrap around these neurons can communicate with each other more effectively. So the message can get sent in a much more rapid pace. And once that rapid connection is coordinated, once these cells can communicate much faster, we have the ability to do much more complex behaviors in a much shorter period of time. So if you think of a young child trying to take their first steps, most of their neurons, most of these cells that are necessary for them to be able to communicate between their brain and their limbs are not myelinated. And this lack of myelination causes the child to take much longer to do anything that they're trying to do in order to communicate between their brain and their limbs or any other part of their mind that's involved in the process. As we age and as myelination occurs, these cells have the ability to communicate much, much more quickly. And that quick communication allows us to do a number of different things in much more complex ways. So in addition to this concept of the neuron plasticity or neuroplasticity, myelination is another big thing that allows us to become much more complex individuals as we age. Now, in addition to this neuroplasticity and myelination, one final thing that actually happens during development is kind of surprising. What we see within the brain is that even though we have a large number of neurons at birth, and there's the expectation that these neurons should help us in development, as we age, a lot of these neurons are actually removed from our system. We call this process synaptic pruning. What we see is that a lot of cells kind of die naturally, and a lot of connections that we might form at a young age as we progress actually are severed. And these severances of these connections, in theory, allow our brain to be much more efficient. And because of this, what we often see, because of synaptic pruning and the process of moving neurons and synapses, we see our brains becoming more dense but more efficient as we age. In particular, we see very specific stages of development as we progress throughout our lives. Between the ages of 3 to 5, we actually have a very specific lobe in our cerebral cortex that tends to grow, to have more synaptic pruning and more neuroplasticity at this stage. The frontal lobe is coordinating different types of planning and organization and really higher levels of processing and thought. And because of that, after we reach the age of about 5, we become much more complex individuals. We have the ability to think about things. We actually have the ability to really understand what's going on in our environment. But we're limited in a number of different aspects as well until we reach about the age of 5, where a new type of synaptic pruning and neural migration actually takes place. at about the age of 5 to 15, instead of having the frontal lobe being the main focus of development, our parietal and our temporal lobes get a large amount of focus. And these areas are dedicated to things like movement, coordination, and speech and language abilities. And these three areas of development are really paramount in our growth as youth, as children, and young adolescents when we look at developments. And this growth in these abilities, things that are critical to these different ages, is a direct product of the synaptic pruning and the neural growth that we see within our system. When we look at specific development, though, we can also see that at adolescence, not only do we have this continued level of pruning, these continued levels of growth and neural migration, but we also have specific areas of the brain also change in activation. In particular, two of the areas that we've already mentioned earlier, the amygdala and the hippocampus, undergo great changes during adolescence. And that development of the amygdala, which is responsible for the increase of the hormones that we talked about in the last class, is also responsible for a lot of cognitive side effects as well. The amygdala is a specific region of the brain that's actually there for emotions. And because of the rapid growth of the amygdala at this age, we typically see adolescents also experiencing cognitive changes in emotions as well. So not only is their body changing, but their brain is changing. They're becoming much, much more adept at experiencing a large range of emotions, and they're also experiencing much, much stronger emotions as well. This change in the range of emotions and stronger emotions is compounded by the fact that the other area, the area that's responsible for really coordinating emotions and coordinating thoughts, still is yet to develop. And that area, if you look to the right upper hand corner, we'll see is called the prefrontal cortex. This is the area that's really associated with judgment and higher levels of thoughts. Now, with the rapid growth of the amygdala, and that huge amount of development in that system, and the lack of growth in the prefrontal cortex, we get in a unique situation with adolescence where there's a huge range of emotions. There's a huge experience of emotions, but very little ability to actually control that. Until we reach about the age of 25, in fact, this particular area, the prefrontal cortex, which is related to planning, doesn't actually develop fully. And this causes a lot of unusual situations and problems with a lot of teens and people in their early 20s, because there's emotions there, there's all these plans there, these thoughts, but there's not a lot of ability to really control for the long term, to think about long span futures. It can happen. There's a number of individuals that still have the ability to coordinate their thoughts and coordinate their plans despite feeling much greater emotions and despite being more focused on the moment and being affected more by the situation. But it's much more difficult to do this at this age. And as we progress, it becomes much, much easier as our prefrontal cortex tends to develop. After adolescence and early adulthood, we reach a stage in our brain development which is actually unique, because instead of having our brain grow, having new connections and having all of these different synapses form and this myelination of specific cells constantly happening, we go from an increase to a decline. And what we see because of this decline, because of this lack of growth, is actually a loss in brain structure. In fact, our brain, as we age, tends to lose about 5 to 10% of its original brain weight. In addition to losing some of its brain weight, a lot of synapses are actually severed through pruning. Now, this doesn't happen for all things, so if you're doing something repetitively, those synapses, those neural connections associated with that behavior, shouldn't be affected. But if you're doing something less frequently, if it's something that you don't usually think about or a task that you're not usually performing, synaptic pruning very likely could occur at that specific point, and that allows your brain to dedicate its resources, which are theoretically becoming more limited as we age, to those tasks, to those connections that are absolutely essential for your survival and entertainment. Another thing we see, though, is that some of this lack of size, this shrinking of the brain, is also related to a loss of myelination. So these cells not only die off themselves, but those cells that are wrapped around the neurons, those glial cells, which is a term that you don't need to know, but that's the name of the cells wrapped around these cells, actually die off as well. And by dying off, those connections between the cells slow down a little bit, the communication doesn't happen as rapidly, and the weight of the brain simultaneously is also lessened. Now, we do think, at least for a long period of time, we had thought that most of the time when we're born, we have pretty much all the neurons we're capable of having. Now, there's two exceptions to this that we found. We found that neurons in a specific area of our there's a specific area of our olfactory bulb, which is responsible for hearing, is actually capable of creating new neurons. And another area in our brain called the hippocampus, which is responsible for memories, is also capable of coming up with new neurons. But what we believed for a long time was that those two areas were the only two areas after birth that were capable of creating new neurons. Recent research that has showed, though, that this might not be entirely the case. A couple of researchers have started to argue that we can create new neurons. We can have something called neurogenesis long after birth in other areas if we're exercising those areas, if we're causing those areas to be active. That might entice us, or our body, to produce more neurons to allow us to accommodate for the situations that we're encountering. But this is still a very hot debate, and we're still not sure whether or not this neurogenesis process is actually occurring. However, as we look at aging and that lack of growth, what we see, just like we saw with lack of growth in the body as we age, or that kind of decline that we saw, exercise and experience do change the rate of decline. In particular, if an individual is very active, constantly processing things, constantly engaged, that decline in size of the brain that we saw, or we usually see in most individuals, doesn't have to actually happen. In fact, the brain can become much more dense and have a lot more complexity to it if we experience a lot of more engaging events in our life. And this experience can carry over to a lot of different mechanisms. In particular, we have greater synapse density, so there's more connections between cells, and the blood flow to the cells that are responsible for communication is also much, much greater. Theoretically, it could even help us create more neurons as well. What I'd like you guys to do before we move on to the very last section of these slides is watch a brief video, it's about 10 minutes long, that actually goes into detail of some of the research that's looked at how activity might relate to brain growth and brain maintenance as we age. So please, take a minute, connect to that link that's located on this slide, and it should bring up a video for you to actually watch. If you can't see this, email me and I'll figure out a way to get you this link. But this video should give you a chance to see some of the more current research that's shown how experience in older age can actually prevent our brain from decaying like we would typically see. Hopefully guys you've seen the video now. For those of you that are waiting to do that, make sure you don't forget to do that before you do the write-ups for this section. But just to review what we've covered to class today for everybody, what we focused on in the beginning of this section was physical development, how our bodies actually change, they grow and alter as we progress. In the second half of this class, what we focused on was kind of our anatomy within the brain and our nervous system, and how those structures actually grow and change as we age. And that marks the end of this coverage of physical change and development. But there's other sections that we're going to be definitely talking about that relate to this physical growth. In the next class in particular, we're going to be looking at development of our motor and sensory systems. But if you can, not only forget to read those sections, but also don't forget to work on this section's write-ups as well. Remember, they're due at the end of this little span, so don't delay, don't dawdle, because those are due much quicker than you think. That's it for today's lecture. Have a great week, well, a great couple days, everybody, and I look forward to seeing you soon.